Since moving into the ancient house, my husbandly way and I felt something was off. There was always a musty smell lingering, and the old furniture seemed to harbor endless secrets. But the most disconcerting was the wallpaper in our bedroom. It had a complex pattern, intricately labyrinthine, with a deep turquoise color that seemed to swallow all light. At night, under the faint illumination left in the room, the wallpaper looked particularly eerie. We started to notice that it seemed to breathe, gently undulating as though something were residing within the wall beneath. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But when I stared, the subtle movement was alarmingly discernible. I told Li Wei, but he just laughed it off, suggesting I was spooked by the house's atmosphere. However, over time, that breathing became more pronounced. At night, in the stillness, we could hear a murmuring and scratching from the walls. It sounded hoarse and deep, as if something struggled beneath the wallpaper, wanting to burst out. Li Wei started to believe me, and we even tried to peel off the wallpaper, but found nothing but the solid wall underneath. Yet, the bizarre sounds never ceased, growing more frantic, more ferocious. We began to suffer from insomnia, chilled by those sounds. During the day, under the bright sunshine, everything seemed so normal, and the wallpaper was just decoration. But at night, it changed. Those terrifying sounds, and the almost palpable malice, pushed us to the edge of breakdown. Finally, we decided to move out. On the day we left, I looked back at our bedroom. The breathing wallpaper glowed brilliantly in the afternoon sun, its pattern as if waving goodbye or perhaps warning. We never learned what was hidden beneath that wallpaper. Maybe it was some unknown creature, or perhaps a secret the old house refused to reveal. It continues there, breathing, waiting for the next unfortunate residents. Since the unanticipated fog descended, the whole city seemed to be masked under an eerie reflection. I'm just a regular librarian in the city, named Emily. The fog started at dawn while I was still immersed in sleep, silently engulfing every street, every building. That morning, when I pushed open the window, the world in front of me seemed twisted. The distant scenery was blurry, and the outlines of nearby objects seemed to shudder. It wasn't just the visual hindrance brought by the fog, everything was like a reflection in a mirror, both real and illusory. People on the streets were panicked and lost, their faces faintly visible in the fog. Most disturbingly, I began to see my late father in this twisted world. He stood at the corner, wearing his favorite plaid shirt, smiling at me just like those afternoons we had spent together years ago. I knew it wasn't real, everyone did. We saw departed loved ones in this reflected city or found ourselves living drastically different lives, a life you never dared to think about or one deep within your heart. My friend Mary told me she saw herself as a dancer, twirling gracefully on a grand stage, whereas, in real life, she was a dreary accountant. People were drawn to these illusions, some even tried to delve into them, attempting to touch, to experience that possible world. But soon, we learned how deadly the consequences of these actions were. Those who tried to interact with people in the reflection or enter that world disappeared. They were as though consumed by the fog, never to return. The city fell into panic, people dared not approach the illusions anymore, and the government started imposing curfews, trying to manage this catastrophe. I don't know when all this will end or if we could ever retrieve those who were lost. This city, once familiar and dear, has now become a trap full of sorrow and fear. Every night, as the darkness falls and the fog seems to grow thicker, making the reflected world even clearer, I hide under my blankets, not daring to look outside. Because I know, in that twisted, reflected light, the kind face of my father is smiling at me, and I am powerless. The rain was incessant that year when I moved into the small town. The rain tapped a rhythm on the cobblestone streets, and pedestrians hurried by with their umbrellas, avoiding the puddles. And there he was, the boy standing on the corner, always drenched, holding a paper boat, staring blankly ahead. I saw him every day on my way home from work. He seemed out of place, wearing an old-fashioned school uniform, as if time had stopped for him while the world changed. At first, I thought he was just a regular child waiting for someone, until one day, I couldn't resist approaching him. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice nearly drowned out by the rain. He lifted his head, looking at me with his almost transparent eyes, and then, unsettlingly, smiled. He didn't answer, simply handed me the paper boat. I took it instinctively, and a chill spread from my arm throughout my body. For a moment, the raindrops around us seemed to freeze. I closed my eyes tightly, and when I opened them, the boy was gone. The paper boat in my hand was unnaturally heavy, with a strange name and a series of numbers on it. A birthday, I later realized, and the death date of someone who had passed in this world. From then on, I started to investigate the boy's identity. The old folks in town told me that decades ago, a child had drowned in a flood, and his lingering spirit was due to looking for the one who sent him to the other side. Supposedly, everyone who took his paper boat would get involved in a bizarre incident and then disappear, silently taken by the rain. Days passed, and I began to sense the world around me becoming distorted and blurry. I saw rain flowing upwards, heard crying from beneath the ground, and sometimes felt someone watching me in the dark. I realized that I was slowly becoming a prisoner of another realm, and that boy was the guide. On a rainy night, I saw the boy again. This time, he had no paper boat, just standing quietly. I approached, looking into his transparent eyes, and asked, "What do you really want?" The air froze, and he spoke, his voice seemingly from another world, "Find him." In the days that followed, I started searching for the person that name represented. After a struggle, I found an old man who confessed, trembling, that it was his dam that had collapsed that year, causing the tragedy. And now, it was his birthday, the death date of the boy. I brought him to the corner where the boy waited in the rain. The old man apologized through tears, and for the first time, there was light in the boy's eyes. He smiled and disappeared into the rain. From that day on, the corner was empty, and I finally understood all he wanted was an apology. Ever since I moved into this old mansion, would often hear vague footsteps upstairs in the dead of night. Initially, I thought it was the creaking of the old wooden structure, but subsequent events forced me to reconsider this reasonable explanation. One late night, while I was in the study perusing ancient books, trying to dispel the restlessness of a sleepless night, I suddenly felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I froze, turned around, but saw nothing. However, when I looked down, I saw a trail of wet footprints on the floor, leading into the dark corridor. From then on, I began to pay attention to every detail in the house. During the day, the mansion was like a sleeping face, quiet and ancient, but at night, when everything was shrouded in darkness and silence, it became strange and restless, as if something was trapped in a crack in time, unable to extricate itself. In the following days, I could often sense the presence of a person, especially at night. What was more disturbing, I began to see the figure of a woman in the mirror. She stood behind me, dressed in an old-fashioned long dress, but what terrified me most was that she had no face. Yes, there was nothing on her face, just a blur of flesh color, without eyes or mouth. I tried to seek help from the outside, but whenever someone visited, whether during the day or at night, the woman would vanish. At first, my friends tried to comfort me, but gradually, they began to worry about my mental state. One night, as I sat on the couch in the living room, anxious and uneasy, the woman appeared suddenly. She stood in front of me, her faceless head tilted as if examining me with non-existent eyes. I was so nervous I could hardly breathe, but curiosity deep inside made me speak, my voice trembling. Who are you?" At that moment, everything froze. The air seemed to solidify, and my heartbeat sounded like the only echo in this silence. Then, the incredible happened. She began to answer me, not with sound, but with words formed directly in my mind. She told me that she had been the owner of this house and had died in a horrific fire many years ago. The fire took her family and destroyed her face. Since then, she had been unable to leave this world or face her family. Her soul was trapped in pain and loneliness, wandering in this house, becoming a being without a face. I was deeply moved by her story and decided to help her. After a series of efforts, I contacted her descendants and held a simple ceremony to pray for her and her family. A miracle happened. That night, I saw her in my dream. Her face was restored, beautiful, and kind. She smiled at me and then walked into a place of light. Since then, the faceless woman never appeared again, and the old house returned to its former tranquility. I know she has finally found her face and the peace within her heart. This is a tale set in the countryside. When I was young, I would visit my grandparents in the village every summer. The summers there were marked by gentle sun and fresh air, with fireflies dancing over the fields at night, their glows like lanterns lit by the night sky. However, one event disrupted this tranquility. It was a stuffy afternoon, and my brother and I were adventuring outdoors when we stumbled upon an old phone booth at the end of a trail, entwined with vines and weeds. It seemed out of place amidst the surrounding fields. Driven by curiosity, my brother stepped inside, and I followed. A musty smell permeated the booth, and an old telephone hung silently on the wall, as if waiting. Without hesitation, my brother picked up the receiver and held it to his ear. I saw his face turn pale, his body trembling. "What do you hear?" I asked nervously. He didn't answer, instead handing me the receiver. Hesitant yet curious, I held it to my ear. Then, I heard a faint sound, like whispering wind, speaking indiscernible words. The voice was ethereal and sorrowful, like a call from another world. Scared, we ran home, but the whisper lingered, keeping me awake at night. The next day, I mustered the courage to return alone. As I lifted the receiver, the whispering resumed, but this time I understood. Why did you leave me? The voice was hauntingly familiar, tightening my heart. It was my mother, who had passed away unexpectedly years ago. Since then, I often returned to that booth alone, secretly. Although each whisper was heart-wrenching, it became my sole link to the past. Until one day, the whispers vanished. The village eventually dismantled the phone booth, and the voice disappeared into the wind forever. On a dark and windy night, our group of 5 drove to an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. The building was pitch black, with only occasional moonlight filtering through the broken windows, casting a few pale rays of light. Our footsteps echoed in the empty lobby, each step as if warning us that we were not welcome. "Are we really going to play this game?" Xiaomin asked quietly, her voice full of anxiety. "Don't be scared, we chose this place specifically for the elevator game," Jianwei said, pulling out the prepared guide that detailed the urban legend of how to use the elevator to enter another world. We squeezed into the rundown elevator, and as the doors slowly closed, an inexplicable sense of oppression enveloped everyone. The elevator was filled with the smell of rust, and the graffiti on the walls seemed to recount the unknown past of this building. With each button Jianwei pressed, we felt a wave of unease permeate the air. The elevator began its slow ascent and descent. First floor, second, fourth, 10th. Every time the elevator doors opened, the dim lighting and the silence of the corridors reminded us that this was a place cut off from the world. When the doors opened for the 5th time, we saw the back of a girl. She stood at the end of the hallway, dressed in a white dress, with her black hair down. We held our breath, fearing to break this delicate balance. According to the game's rules, we were not to make eye contact with her or speak to her. The doors closed again, and we proceeded with the next step. But what happened next was completely beyond our expectations. When we pressed the button for the 5th floor again, instead of stopping, the elevator began to ascend on its own. We panicked, pushing all the buttons, but it was no use. The elevator seemed to be controlled by some force, taking us straight to the top floor. As the doors opened, the scene before us had completely changed. It was still a part of the building, but all the colors had turned grayer, and a nauseating stench permeated the air. We seemed to hear wails and whispers, and at the end of the hallway, the figure of the girl appeared again, turning slowly towards us, yet where her face should be was only profound darkness. Terrified, we ran, trying to find our way back. But in this twisted world, every direction led only to deeper darkness. After what felt like an eternity, we finally found the elevator again. Without daring any mistake, we followed the instructions from the guide precisely. When the elevator finally returned to the ground floor, the doors slowly opened to daylight rather than moonlight. We stumbled out, back into the world we knew. We had experienced an indescribable terror that night. To this day, I still vividly remember the faceless girl and the twisted world full of resentful spirits behind her. We never spoke of that night again because we knew some games, once started, have no end.